The trail ended where it shouldn't have. Sergeant David Mercer stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the patch of earth in front of him, trying to force meaning into its silence. The ground was soft enough to make impressions. It had rained 2 nights earlier, not enough to flood, but enough to leave the soil receptive. Every step through terrain like this left a signature. Weight, direction, intent, but here there was nothing, not faded, not obscured. Gone. Behind him, his team waited without speaking. 4 men, spaced in careful intervals, each positioned exactly where they needed to be to see without being seen. They had been moving like this for hours, flowing through the Vietnamese jungle with the slow patience of hunters who understood that speed was the enemy of awareness. They had been told this would be straightforward. Follow. Observe. Report. No engagement. No interference. Just confirmation. Mercer lowered himself into a crouch, ignoring the quiet protest in his knees. He studied the last visible print again. It was clean, heel to toe, recently, no more than an hour old. He had followed tracks like this for most of his adult life. Men were predictable when they moved, even trained men. Fatigue, terrain, urgency, everything left evidence, everything except this. He reached out, brushing his fingers lightly across the soil where the next step should have been. Smooth, undisturbed. His mouth had gone dry. Behind him, Corporal Jennings shifted slightly. "You lose it?" Mercer didn't answer immediately, because the question implied something temporary. This wasn't temporary. This was absence. He rose slowly, his eyes scanning outward. The jungle pressed close on all sides, thick and watchful, layers of green folding into shadow, vines hanging like unmoving wires, the air heavy with heat and the faint organic rot of vegetation slowly reclaiming itself. He listened. Nothing. No movement. No displaced leaves. No broken stems. No sound except the distant, endless drone of insects. They had been following a 4-man team. He knew that from the pattern spacing, the stride length, the load distribution visible in the depth of the impressions. 4 men did not simply vanish, not here, not anywhere. He turned back to his team. "They stopped," he said quietly. Jennings frowned. "Stopped and what?" Mercer held his gaze. "They stopped existing." The words hung there, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just true. Hours later, they would retrace their path 3 times. They would expand their search radius in careful widening arcs. They would check for deception, backtracking, terrain masking. They would find nothing. No exit trail, no diversion, no mistake, just the last known position. And then, silence. The helicopter ride back felt longer than the insertion. No one spoke over the engine noise. Each man sat inside his own private reconstruction, replaying the failure step by step, searching for the moment it had slipped beyond their control. Mercer stared out the open side door, watching the jungle roll beneath them in endless waves. Somewhere down there, 4 men were still moving. He knew it, he could feel it, but he could not prove it, and in their profession, proof was everything. The debrief room was colder than outside, artificial, clinical, a place where uncertainty was supposed to be converted into explanation. Mercer sat across from the intelligence officer, his back straight, his face empty of everything except professionalism. A tape recorder sat between them, its reels turning with quiet indifference. The officer's voice was calm. "Sergeant, please describe the point at which you lost visual confirmation." Mercer swallowed. He could feel his team behind him, silent, waiting. He chose his words carefully. "We did not lose visual confirmation, sir." The officer looked up. "Clarify." Mercer held his gaze. "The trail terminated." The officer frowned slightly. "Terminated? Yes, sir." A pause. "The kind that stretched longer than it should. Explain how a 4-man patrol leaves no continuation of movement." Mercer felt heat rise under his collar despite the cold air. He had no answer that would preserve his dignity, or theirs. He spoke anyway. "We don't know, sir." The tape recorder continued spinning. The officer leaned back slightly, studying him. At that moment, Mercer felt something unfamiliar. Not fear, exposure. because their entire identity was built on competence, on the promise that nothing could move through their environment without their awareness. And now something deliberate, something disciplined, something that had understood they were being followed and had chosen to disappear. The officer glanced down at the file in front of him. When he looked back up, his voice was quieter. "Are you certain the patrol existed?" Mercer felt the question like a strike, because part of him had asked the same thing. Had they followed ghosts? No. He had seen the prints. He had measured their weight. He had read their presence in the earth itself. They had been real, which meant their disappearance was real too. "Yes, sir," Mercer said. The officer nodded slowly, though his expression suggested uncertainty had already taken root. The debrief ended soon after. No reprimand, no accusation, just something worse. Silence. Mercer stood and left the room, his team falling in behind him. In the corridor, Jennings finally spoke. What the hell were they? Mercer didn't answer, because he didn't know. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the humiliation and the doubt, another realization had begun to form. They had not lost amateurs. They had lost professionals, men who understood terrain the way Mercer did, men who understood pursuit, men who had known exactly how to leave behind a last known position and nothing else. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of explanation, those four men were still walking. And the most unsettling part was not that they had escaped. It was that they had done it on purpose. One message remaining. Upgrad, a trail is not a line in the dirt. It is a confession. Every moving body leaves one. Every boot compresses soil, shifts pebbles, bruises grass blades in a direction they were not meant to bend. Fabric brushes bark. Metal scrapes stone. Sweat drips salt into dust that darkens for minutes before the sun reclaims it. The earth records everything. The only question is whether someone has been trained to read it. Corporal Nate Harlan learned that the hard way on his first deployment. He had believed movement discipline meant spacing, noise control, proper intervals. It meant that in the conventional infantry sense, maintain 5 meters, avoid skyline silhouettes, sweep brass. He had been told that if the enemy could not see you, you were safe enough. Then an older reconnaissance sergeant walked him back along their patrol route at dawn and pointed silently at the ground. Harlan saw nothing at first, just scrub and sand. Then the sergeant crouched, tapped a faint crescent pressed into the soil. "That's your heel," he said quietly. "Your advertising. In standard units, trail awareness is defensive. You minimize it to reduce ambush probability. You avoid obvious tracks in soft terrain. You step on rock when you can. But the baseline assumption remains that contact, if it occurs, will escalate to firefight, extraction, reinforcement. Discovery is a tactical problem. In denied environments, discovery is an existential one. Professional trackers, whether tribal scouts, counterinsurgency specialists, or border security units, read ground signs the way analysts read signals intelligence. They do not look for footprints alone. They look for pattern disruptions, a line of disturbed insects where ants have rebuilt a path. Dew displaced unevenly at first light, twigs snapped not by wind but by downward force, a cigarette butt crushed with a heel too cleanly to be accidental. They assess stride length to estimate load weight. They measure depth to infer fatigue. A 4-man patrol moving 10 kilometers across mixed terrain will leave, conservatively, hundreds of micro-indicators. Multiply that by 12 operators, by vehicles, by resupply caches, and the signature compounds geometrically. Even disciplined infantry cannot erase the arithmetic of movement. They can only reduce its clarity. What separates a conventional military unit from a denied environment team is not how much they train. It is what they believe about presence. For most formations, terrain is a surface to cross. For certain units, it is an intelligence service waiting to testify. Major Andrew Kessler understood this distinction academically long before he saw its implications operationally. In briefings, it was presented as movement doctrine tiers: Level 1, basic fieldcraft; Level 2, counter-tracking awareness; Level 3, signature management under hostile surveillance, but those categories disguise the psychological shift required. At the highest tier, operators do not think about how to move through terrain. They think about how to move without having moved. Consider something as simple as a boot print in dry soil. Standard infantry doctrine teaches stepping on hard ground when possible, brushing over obvious impressions, dispersing movements to avoid creating a single defined trail. Effective to a point, but a trained tracker does not need a single clear print. He needs rhythm. He looks for compressed patches spaced at predictable intervals. Even if each one is partial, together they form cadence. Denied environment teams break cadence. They alter stride unpredictably. They move in offset files designed not for fire and maneuver but for sign disruption. The last man in line does not merely provide rear security. He studies the ground behind the patrol, correcting disturbances with deliberate, practiced gestures, scuffing, redistributing debris, re-erecting bent vegetation. It is slow. It is exhausting. It can double movement time. Now the layer environment. In wet clay, depth reveals load weight within kilograms. In arid sand, wind becomes both ally and adversary. In the jungle, broken spider webs can betray passage hours later, glistening in angled sunlight. In snow, there is no forgiveness at all. Harlan remembered the first time he tried to backtrack his own path during advanced reconnaissance training. The instructors had given his team a 2-hour head start. They believed they had moved cleanly, spaced properly. Avoid soft ground. When the tracking cadre caught up before noon, they did not shout. They simply pointed, a faint smear of mud on a rock where a boot had slipped, a displaced stone revealing damp earth beneath, darker than its surroundings, a crushed patch of moss that would not spring back for another day. It was not incompetence, it was ontology. The team had moved as soldiers. The cadre moved as ghosts, units that operate where capture means political denial or permanent disappearance cannot accept the baseline risk conventional forces tolerate. If discovered, they cannot rely on quick reaction forces or diplomatic intervention. Their existence may be unacknowledged. In such spaces, a trail is not a route to contact, it is a roadmap to annihilation. This is where doctrine diverges sharply. Standard military patrols balance speed and stealth. Time on target often outweighs perfect concealment. A mission window may be measured in minutes. The calculus accepts a measurable probability of being tracked because engagement remains survivable. Denied environment doctrine inverts that priority. It sacrifices tempo to reduce signature below detection threshold. If average infantry movement covers 3 km/h across broken ground, a signature-managed team may accept half that speed. If conventional units rotate pointman every 20 minutes to manage fatigue, these teams rotate based on who can best read and correct terrain disturbance at that moment. It is not more training in volume. It is a different relationship with existence. The scout team, whose trail would later be analyzed, had moved with discipline by conventional standards. Their intervals were correct, their noise signature is minimal, their equipment was secured. On radio intercept review, nothing suggested recklessness. But when a local tracking cell began reconstructing their route, it took less than 4 hours to establish direction of travel. Why? Because conventional discipline reduces visibility, it does not erase it. In the operations room, satellite imagery displayed a faint line through scrubland barely perceptible unless you knew what to overlay. Ground reconnaissance later confirmed it, subtle compression in a dry wash, repeated disturbances near water sources where canteens had been refilled. The team had chosen logical rest points. Logical becomes predictable, predictable becomes traceable. Kessler stared at the photos under fluorescent light, jaw tight. The difference between standard and denied environment movement was no longer theoretical. It was measured in how long the enemy needed to find you. 48 hours, acceptable in many theaters. 4 hours, catastrophic. The shocking truth was not that the scouts had been sloppy. It was that they had been normal. Somewhere else, another unit was operating under a harsher standard. They moved as if the terrain itself were hostile intelligence. They planned routes not for efficiency but for ambiguity. They selected footwear based on tread-to-fusion patterns. They rehearsed river crossings not just to avoid drowning, but to break sign continuity. And when analysts overlaid their suspected movement corridor on satellite imagery, they found almost nothing, no cadence, no rhythm, no confession. The gap between these two approaches is invisible to the untrained eye. On paper, both are elite, both are disciplined, both pass selection courses with attrition rates exceeding 70%. But one leaves behind evidence that a trained adversary can assemble into narrative. The other leaves doubt. In hostile space, doubt is survival. As the investigation into the compromised scout route deepened, a quieter realization emerged. If one team had been found so quickly, it was not because they lacked courage or skill. It was because they operated under a doctrine that assumed the possibility of recovery. The other team did not. And that difference, subtle, architectural, almost philosophical, would soon explain not only how one unit was discovered, but who had mastered the art of erasing themselves so completely that even the ground could not testify against them. They were never supposed to appear on a map. No insignia, no public brief, no press statement if things went wrong. The only record of their presence would exist in classified annexes and in the memories of men trained to forget what they could not acknowledge. The unit moving through that valley did not officially exist in that theater. Their government had advisors there, yes, trainers, intelligence liaisons, but not this. Not a four-man Special Reconnaissance detachment operating 70 kilometers beyond the declared operational boundary, inside terrain controlled by a militia that denied foreign presence with violent enthusiasm. Their mission parameters were narrow and surgical. Confirm whether a mid-tier logistics facilitator codenamed Vesper had relocated into a newly constructed compound along the irrigation belt. Identify ingress and egress routes. Assess whether a capture operation could be mounted within a 30-minute window without triggering regional escalation. They were not there to engage, they were there to see, and seeing in that valley required a discipline so extreme it bordered on ritual. The team leader, Corzine Mason, had rehearsed the insertion geometry in his head for days. The helicopter would not land. It would hover at 5 meters above scrub terrain, rotor wash flattening dry grass in a circular signature visible from above. They would step off into darkness and move immediately, not along the obvious goat tracks, but through the dead ground between irrigation channels where the earth absorbed sound. The first technique was movement without pattern. Most units, even elite ones, default to terrain logic, follow ridgelines, use drainage routes, exploit vegetation. Mason's team did the opposite. They deliberately avoided the most tactically efficient paths because those were the paths insurgents expected foreign operators to use. Instead, they crossed open patches in short, timed intervals calibrated to local noise cycles. When irrigation pumps roared to life, they moved. When generators sputtered and dogs barked in chorus, they advanced. When the valley fell silent, they froze, even if it cost them minutes. It was counterintuitive, almost perverse from the outside, moving in exposed ground when cover was available, pausing when doctrine said press. But the objective was not speed, it was unpredictable. The second technique was thermal humility. In that region, insurgent fighters had learned to use commercially available thermal scopes. They could not match military-grade sensors, but they were good enough to detect careless heat signatures in cold, pre-dawn hours. Mason's team mitigated this not only through standard insulating layers, but by timing halts near livestock pens and irrigation pumps where ambient heat muddied their silhouette. They lay prone beside irrigation pipes still warm from afternoon sun. They positioned themselves downwind of cattle, letting animal body heat distort their outline. To an outside observer, it looked almost absurd, 4 foreign soldiers pressing into mud beside livestock. To a thermal optic, it looked like a background. The third technique was acoustic subtraction. Most units trained to minimize sound. Mason's team trained to erase it. Loose metal buckles were taped not just once but layered until they could not click even under pressure. Weapons were wrapped in fabric to dull incidental contact. They adjusted breathing cadence during movement, synchronizing exhalations to external noise so no single breath rose above the valley's baseline hum. In rehearsals, they practiced crawling across gravel, while instructors stood meters away in blindfolds, listening for disturbance. Failure was not shouting or obvious clatter. Failure was a single displaced pebble. In the valley, this discipline translated into an almost unnatural stillness. When they stopped, they did not shift weight. They did not scratch. They allowed insects to crawl across exposed skin rather than risk motion. The fourth technique was narrative camouflage. This one was less physical, more psychological. If compromised, they were not to fight unless survival demanded it. Their uniforms were stripped of national identifiers. Equipment was commercially sourced where possible. Even their ammunition, while effective, was selected to mirror calibers common in the region. If something was found, it needed to suggest ambiguity, not attribution. This requirement shaped their loadout in subtle ways. No uniquely marked optics, no proprietary communication hardware visible externally. Radios were modified to fit into locally purchased casings. Batteries were standard commercial brands, indistinguishable from civilian stock. They carried less than typical assault elements ammunition, reduced by nearly 30% to lighten movement and reduce dropped item risk. Every piece of gear was inventoried at halt points. A missing item triggered immediate retrace no matter the delay. To outside forces, this level of precaution could appear obsessive, but Mason understood the cost of residue. A single identifiable object could shift diplomatic posture, could transform a reconnaissance patrol into a geopolitical incident. Their invisibility was not just tactical, it was political. Inside the compound they were tracking, Vesper's men followed a different doctrine. They moved with visible weapons, projecting presence. They believed in intimidation, geometry, dominant rooftops, overt patrols, loud generators that announced occupancy. Their power lay in being seen and feared. Mason's power lay in being unseen and unprovable. The contrast was stark. One side asserted control through visibility, the other through absence. As the team approached the suspected objective, they did not set up directly overlooking the compound. That would be predictable. Instead, they positioned 280 meters offset behind a half-collapsed irrigation wall that offered partial line of sight through a broken segment of roofline. It reduced visual clarity, but enhanced concealment. They accepted imperfect observation in exchange for survivability. Through low-light optics, Mason observed movement inside the courtyard. 2 armed men, a pickup truck, no immediate sign of Vesper. He did not adjust position. Patience was part of the unreality. They could remain there for hours, barely breathing, becoming part of the terrain's static geometry. At headquarters, analysts monitored intermittent bursts from the team's encrypted comms. Position confirmed. Observation ongoing. No compromise. To those watching from air-conditioned rooms, it appeared routine. 4 icons on a digital map. But on the ground, the valley pressed in. Mosquitoes hummed, the smell of stagnant water mixed with diesel exhaust. A dog barked once, twice, then fell silent. Mason's knees ached against the stone. His cheek rested against earth still radiating the day's heat. He knew the unspoken truth. If they were discovered, official response would be delayed. Plausible deniability required distance. Extraction timelines would stretch. Their survival depended entirely on remaining a rumor. That awareness sharpened discipline into something almost spiritual. They were not just reducing signatures. They were reducing existence. And as the night deepened, something shifted in the compound. Additional vehicles arrived, more men than expected, a pattern inconsistent with prior intelligence. Mason felt the first tremor of unease. The techniques that had made them invisible were working perfectly. No compromise, no alarms, which meant what they were seeing was real. And if it was real, then the map that had placed this compound within manageable parameters was already wrong. The unit that wasn't supposed to be there had done its job flawlessly. But invisibility, Mason realized as he watched new figures emerge into the courtyard, does not protect you from the consequences of what you discover. It only ensures that when those consequences arrive, you will face them alone. The first sign that something was wrong was the absence of anything wrong. Staff Sergeant Eli Navarro had spent 12 years reading ground the way other men read handwriting. He knew how weight distributed through soil, how rubber bit into gravel, how a careless heel left impatience stamped in dust. In the training areas back home, instructors used to joke that he could smell a boot print before he saw it. So when the patrol he was tasked to follow crossed into the wadi and the earth went blank, his first instinct was not confusion, it was irritating. They moved at dawn, light spilling low and horizontal across the valley floor, stretching shadows into long blue fingers. The terrain was textbook for tracking fine sand along the wash, broken patches of clay where moisture had once pooled, small islands of scrub that caught fabric fibers and skin flakes if a man brushed too close. Navarro crouched, fingertips hovering a centimeter above the ground. He never touched sign immediately. First, he read the surface tension, the way dust had settled overnight. The wind had been light, maybe 3 knots from the north. That should have preserved impressions made after midnight. He found nothing. Behind him, his 2-man team spread laterally, eyes scanning for the micro-anomalies that defined their craft. Displaced pebbles, a crushed insect, a blade of grass bent against the prevailing wind. Nothing. It wasn't that the terrain was pristine. There were goat tracks, old vehicle ruts hardened by weeks of sun, random scuffs likely from villagers moving between compounds. But none of it resolved into the disciplined rhythmic pattern of a trained unit moving tactically. Navarro checked his time hack. According to intelligence, the unit they were shadowing had crossed this same wadi less than 6 hours earlier. 8 men, fully equipped. Even the best could not erase mass. He exhaled slowly through his nose, letting the air carry the faint smell of dry earth and animal waste. His brain ran through variables automatically. Wind speed, soil composition, possible hard ground movement along rock shelves. Shift left 10 meters, he murmured to his assistant team leader. Check the edge of the clay. They moved methodically, boots placed deliberately on already disturbed ground to avoid contaminating the scene. Navarro's pulse remained steady. This was a puzzle, not a crisis. Then the second anomaly surfaced. At the edge of the clay patch, he found a partial impression. The faintest outline of tread-modern, aggressive lug pattern, consistent with the type of boot their target unit favored. It was shallow, barely a whisper on the surface. He studied it for nearly a full minute. The depth was wrong. An 80-kilogram operator with kit should depress this soil at least 5 millimeters under current moisture conditions. This print barely kissed the surface, as if weight had been reduced or distributed. Navarro felt the first flicker of professional unease. He followed the angle of that partial print forward. It vanished. No continuation, no stride pattern, no alternating foot placement. He widened the search radius. 5 meters, 10, 20, 20. Nothing. His radio remained silent, but he knew higher headquarters expected a steady flow of updates. Contact reports. Direction of travel. Confirmation that the trail was being maintained. He keyed the handset anyway. Scout 1. Initial sign inconclusive, continuing sweep. In the operations cell kilometers away, an intelligence officer made a small notation but did not yet feel concern. Null readings happened. Trackers sometimes lost a trail for short intervals, especially on mixed terrain. Back in the wadi, the sun climbed, flattening shadows and washing contrast from the ground. Navarro removed his gloves to feel the soil directly. It was cool beneath the surface crust, undisturbed in ways that contradicted every briefing slide he had studied. His assistant found a fiber-snagged on thorn scrubber fragment of synthetic thread, consistent with tactical clothing. They both stared at it. It was at shoulder height. If the unit had brushed that shrub, there should be prints beneath it. Compression in the sand. A pivot mark. Something. The ground remained mute. Navarro's irritation hardened into something closer to vertigo. Tracking doctrine relies on accumulation. A single sign means little. A pattern confirms direction, tempo, intent. Here, each potential indicator appeared in isolation, disconnected from the next. Like letters scattered without forming words, he replayed the possibilities. Had the unit moved along rock shelves exclusively? Unlikely. The shelf ran only 30 meters before dropping back to sand. Had they used stepping techniques to minimize imprint? Even the lightest footfall leaves micro-displacement detectable to a trained eye, unless weight had been redistributed through deliberate load-bearing adjustments, unless spacing had been altered to overlap prints precisely, unless movement tempo had been synchronized to wind gusts. He straightened slowly, scanning the wider terrain. The valley itself seemed to withhold information. The breeze carried fine dust that settled evenly, smoothing minor irregularities. Goat herds had passed through at some point, their hooves peppering the surface with chaotic patterns that could conceal deliberate placement. But concealment requires trace. You hide within noise. You do not eliminate yourself entirely. Navarro felt the pressure building behind his sternum, not fear of enemy contact, but fear of professional failure. His reputation had been built on certainty. Commanders trusted his assessments because he delivered direction where others saw ambiguity. Now ambiguity was all he had. "Widen to grid Bravo," he ordered quietly. "Double-check drainage line." They worked another hour, knees aching, eyes burning from reflected glare, sweat darkening the collars of their shirts. Each potential lead dissolved under scrutiny, a scuff that resolved into animal disturbance, a depression revealed as natural soil settling. His assistant finally looked at him with an expression Navarro rarely saw in the field. What if they didn't leave a sign? The question hovered, absurd and accusatory. Every unit leaves a sign. Mass interacts with the environment. It is physics. Navarro closed his eyes for a brief second, reconstructing the briefing in his head, the target unit's profile, their training lineage, their reputation for unconventional movement. A memory surfaced, an instructor once describing certain special operations elements that trained specifically to move across terrain without producing legible trails, techniques refined over decades, step placement inside natural depressions, use of hard ground transitions, intentional disruption of rhythm. He had dismissed it at the time as mythologizing. Now he felt it breathing in the empty space around him. He keyed the radio again. This time, his thumb hesitated before pressing transmit. "Scout 1 to command," he began, voice steady despite the churn inside. "Be advised, no continuous track established. Isolated indicators present, but no coherent direction of movement. Assess target utilizing advanced counter-tracking techniques." The words tasted like confession. In the operations cell, silence followed. The intelligence officer glanced at a supervisor. "Clarify," came the reply. Navarro swallowed. "Recommend adjusting assumption of standard movement pattern. Current assessment, trail absence deliberate." He could have manufactured a plausible vector, chosen a direction based on terrain logic, and reported tentative movement. No one would have challenged him immediately. The fog of war provides cover for educated guesses, but he understood the cost of false certainty. Units would maneuver based on his report. Assets would be allocated. Lives might hinge on a trail that existed only in his imagination. Admitting absence felt like stripping away armor. Around him, the valley remained indifferent. Wind brushed across sand, smoothing it further. The environment offered no validation, no correction, just blankness. His professional identity shifted in that moment, not shattered, but recalibrated. Expertise, he realized, was not the ability to always find a sign. It was the discipline to report when the ground refused to speak. As they exfiltrated from the wadi, Navarro cast one final look at the stretch of earth that had defied him. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the unit he was tasked to shadow was moving, leaving impact without imprint. The realization did not humiliate him. It unsettled him. Because if a trained team could traverse terrain he considered transparent without leaving a legible trail, then the battlefield had just become larger than his certainty. And in that expanding silence, new questions began to form about who had mastered it, how and what that mastery would mean for everyone trained to read the ground. The first time they almost found them, it was because of a footprint that wasn't there. At 4:11 local time, a long-endurance drone orbited above a valley that looked from altitude like a dry river of stone. The thermal feed showed nothing but residual heat trapped in rock from the previous day's sun. The algorithms ran automatically, pattern recognition across 12 square kilometers, flagging anomalies, flagging movement, flagging contrast. Nothing. Below, in the gray before sunrise, a 4-man scout team moved through the wadi in a staggered file. They had entered the valley 3 hours earlier, stepping deliberately on stone rather than sand, following the natural fractures in the terrain. Each man carried just under 30 kilograms, suppressed rifles, optics, water, stripped-down sustainment. Their pace was unhurried, their breathing controlled. Sergeant Hale, point man, paused at a bend where the sand deepened for 12 meters before tapering back to rock, 12 meters of soft substrate in an otherwise hard corridor, a trap for trackers. He didn't whisper. He didn't need to. He knelt, studied the wind. It moved lightly from the north, pushing fine dust across the surface in a shallow sheet. He shifted their line 2 meters to the left where the sand thinned against the rock face. Each man stepped precisely into the faint depressions of the one ahead, compressing the same ground twice instead of creating 4 separate signatures. From above, the drone software was calibrated to detect linear disturbances, parallel patterns consistent with human transit. It was exceptionally good at it. In testing, it detected 92% of conventional patrol movement within 30 minutes. This patrol did not look conventional. By 4119, the drone had passed directly overhead. The operator at the console leaned forward, scanning the feed. He felt it an absence too clean. The valley was a textbook infiltration route. Intelligence indicated probable movement within a 24-hour window. Yet the surface remained visually undisturbed. He marked it as clear. On the ground, Hale glanced up once at the faint hum above, then continued moving. They reached the northern exit of the wadi without ever breaking stride. The second, near contact, was closer. 9 days later, a signals collection team established a temporary listening post on a ridgeline 3.4 kilometers east of a suspected transit route. Directional antennas extended like skeletal branches into the wind. The mission was straightforward: intercept low-power intra-team communications used by the unit being tracked. At 22:37, the spectrum analyzer flickered. A narrow spike at 312 MHz, brief, controlled, gone in less than 2 seconds. "Mark that," the technician muttered. They triangulated. The origin appeared to be moving west to east along the predicted corridor. The team adjusted their antenna angle by 5 degrees. Static, then silence. What they did not know was that the scout team had transmitted intentionally one encrypted burst, 1.7 seconds in duration, using a frequency known to be commonly scanned by regional surveillance assets. It was bait. Lieutenant Armitage, trailing the formation that night, had argued quietly during planning that total silence could itself become anomalous. If they expect chatter and get none, they widen the net, he'd said. So they gave them a whisper. Immediately after transmitting, they altered course by 40 degrees south, dropping into a shallow depression masked by scrub brush and broken rock. The terrain swallowed them. On the ridgeline, the signals team expanded their search window along the projected eastbound line. Vehicles were repositioned. Additional assets were tasked. For 3 hours, they monitored a corridor that the scout team had vacated within 90 seconds of the transmission. The signals team logged the event as probable movement, but lost contact due to terrain interference. They were not wrong. They had simply been nudged into the wrong geometry. The third near-miss was the one that changed everything. It happened in daylight. Aerial reconnaissance had shifted from pattern-of-life mapping to high-resolution synthetic aperture radar sweeps designed to detect micro-disturbances, soil compression, displaced foliage, thermal anomalies masked by camouflage. The technology was advanced enough to identify the difference between a natural animal path and human transit with 87% confidence under optimal conditions. At 1312, a sweep over Sector Delta registered a faint linear anomaly across a gravel plain. It was subtle, barely above threshold, but consistent over 600 meters. The analyst flagged it. Ground units were alerted. A quick reaction element staged 12 kilometers away. The anomaly was revisited 30 minutes later, gone. The gravel plain appeared undisturbed. The first assumption was sensor drift. Calibration error, environmental distortion caused by shifting heat layers. The anomaly was logged under equipment malfunction pending review, but one analyst knew meticulous requested the raw data overlay. She layered the initial sweep against historical scans. The disturbance pattern had not been random. It had been segmented, 12 discrete compression points spaced at near-identical intervals, footsteps. Yet the follow-up sweep showed none. What had happened in those 18 minutes between scans was not malfunction. It was erased. On the ground, the scout team had crossed that gravel plain in bounding pairs, deliberately stepping on larger stones that rested loosely atop finer substrate. Each step had created a brief compression signature detectable by radar as a density shift. And then, halfway across, Hale had halted them. He felt it before he could articulate it. The open expanse, the absence of vertical cover, the subtle echo of rotor wash in the distance. He dropped to a knee, studied the stones beneath his boots, and made a decision that would later puzzle analysts. They retraced their exact path. Each man stepped precisely into his own prior footprint, not to reduce tracks that had already been done, but to disturb the gravel a second time in reverse direction, creating a randomized scatter pattern indistinguishable from natural displacement. It took 8 minutes. From above, the second radar sweep interpreted the terrain as normal variance. The quick reaction element arrived to find nothing, no prints, no drag marks, no discarded ration packaging, just whined over stone. Back in the analysis cell, the initial anomaly was reclassified, not malfunction, but transient disturbance of unknown origin. The term was sterile. It concealed what the team was beginning to suspect. These were not accidental blind spots. They were being navigated deliberately. The surveillance architecture had been designed on certain assumptions. Human movement creates patterns. Communication silence is suspicious. Terrain leaves memory. Those assumptions were statistically sound. Against conventional forces they worked, but the unit being tracked appeared to understand those assumptions intimately. They moved not merely to avoid detection, but to manipulate expectation. They created just enough presence to redirect attention. They erased just enough evidence to induce doubt. The pivot came in a closed briefing 2 weeks later. Analysts presented the 3 near misses side by side. The Wardy with no footprints, the 1.7-second transmission followed by geometric deviation, the radar anomaly that vanished. Individually, each event could be explained away: environmental noise, terrain masking, operator error. Collectively, they formed a pattern of intentional invisibility. The realization was uncomfortable because it inverted the premise. The question was no longer why the surveillance system kept failing. It was whether the system's design had been studied by the very unit it was meant to monitor. Somewhere in their training pipeline, someone had taught them how drones search valleys, how signals teams triangulate, how radar interprets compression, which meant they were not merely moving through terrain, they were moving through architecture. On a ridge at dusk, weeks after the third near miss, Hale watched a surveillance aircraft cut a white arc across the sky. He did not resent it, he respected it. The machine was doing exactly what it was built to do. So were they. The tension now was not between hunter and hunted. It was between design and adaptation. Each near contact had tightened the gap by seconds and meters. Each had revealed another layer of disciplined trail management, measured in centimeters, transmissions timed to the second, reversals executed under open sky. And yet the question lingered. If they understood the surveillance architecture precisely, what else did they understand? The next time the anomaly appeared, it would not be dismissed as malfunction. It would be recognized as intent, and recognition changes the game. Because once you know you're operating inside someone else's blind spot by design, the only remaining uncertainty is whether they have already anticipated your correction. The assessment began with confidence. A failure had occurred. Surveillance had been compromised. A scout team had lost visual contact with its target for 11 minutes, long enough for a convoy to vanish into broken terrain and reappear 12 kilometers east, outside projected movement corridors. In a system built on layered sensors and predictive modeling, 11 minutes was not an inconvenience, it was an anomaly, so the institution did what institutions do. It opened a file. In a windowless office 2 floors beneath the operations center, analysts replayed feeds frame by frame. Infrared overlays, satellite snapshots, drone telemetry. The air smelled faintly of overheated circuitry and stale coffee. The lighting never changed. Time existed only in timestamps along the bottom of the screen. The initial hypothesis was procedural error, scout fatigue, misaligned optics, a lapse in reporting discipline. The team had been in position for 9 hours in wind that scraped dust against exposed skin and turned lips metallic. Cognitive degradation charts were pulled. After 8 hours, attention variance increases by 17%. After 10, by nearly 30%. Fatigue was a comfortable explanation, but the transcripts complicated that theory. The scout team's debrief, conducted within 24 hours, was precise. Their patrol leader described movement patterns inconsistent with evasion panic. They didn't accelerate, he said. They didn't scatter. Disappeared. Disappear is not a doctrinal term. It unsettled the room. Video review showed the convoy entering a shallow, waddy terrain broken enough to mask line of sight, but not dense enough to justify total loss of signature. Drone coverage overlapped at 62%. Satellite refresh intervals were within tolerance. There was no technical blackout, yet the convoy dissolved from every layer simultaneously. By the 3rd week of review, the tone in the assessment room shifted. Analysts began mapping not scout error, but adversary capability. The timing of the disappearance aligned with a previously noted pattern in regional signal noise. Electronic signatures had spiked and then flattened, not jammed, not scrambled, simply diluted. A working theory emerged, careful and quiet. The unit being tracked may not have been a conventional insurgent convoy at all. It may have been operating with assistance or training beyond the assumed baseline. The assessment draft evolved. Language hardened from surveillance lapse to possible counter-surveillance capability encountered. That phrase carried weight. It implied parody. It implied that what had occurred was not negligence, but contact with something structurally different. At week 6, a question hovered over the document like a storm front. If this capability exists, who possesses it? Names were never written, but analysts cross-reference movement data with previous joint exercises, with known signatures of allied and adversarial units. One pattern refused to resolve neatly. It matched a profile the institution recognized but rarely documented. Small teams operating with disciplined radio silence, deliberate thermal masking, synchronized maneuver designed not to outrun surveillance, but to saturate it. In the field, the scout team sensed it immediately. Their patrol leader had felt the shift in the air the moment the convoy entered the wadi. It was too clean, he had told the debrief officer, like they knew exactly how long they were invisible. That sentence was underlined twice in the draft. Then the discontinuation order arrived. It was brief, 3 paragraphs. The subject line referenced resource reallocation and operational reprioritization. The language was administrative, almost bored. Further investigative action deemed non-essential at this time. Existing procedural guidance sufficient. No additional findings required. No additional findings required. The assessment team read it in silence. They understood what it meant because of what it did not say. The draft had been approaching a conclusion that would force institutional acknowledgement of a capability that complicated alliances, doctrines, and public narratives. If the unit being tracked was identified, formally, it would demand policy responses, questions about training exchanges, about operational boundaries, about who was operating where and under what authorization. Silence was easier. The scout team's transcripts were reclassified within 48 hours. Access restricted. The after-action record reverted to its earlier phrasing, temporary surveillance degradation due to terrain interference. The convoy's designation was removed. The wadi was reduced to a contour line on a sanitized map. In paperwork, the trail ended exactly where it had ended in the field. But within the institution, the message traveled anyway. The analysts who had watched the footage understood that the scouts had not failed. Their reaction times were within optimal range. Their reporting intervals were disciplined to within seconds. They had encountered a maneuver designed not to evade amateurs, but to test professionals. The irony settled slowly. The institution had initiated the assessment to determine who was responsible for failure. It discontinued the assessment when it realized there had been none. Colonel Harris read the discontinuation memo weeks later, forwarded without commentary. He recognized the phrasing immediately. It was the same bureaucratic dialect used when conclusions were inconvenient. He did not feel vindicated in any ceremonial sense. There would be no reversal of tone in official records. But he understood the reversal had occurred internally. The scout sensed it too. No reprimands followed. No mandatory retraining modules. Instead, during subsequent briefings, subtle adjustments appeared. Expanded acknowledgement of advanced counter-surveillance threats, increased emphasis on layered redundancy, not because the team had underperformed, but because the adversary had overperformed. That distinction was never spoken aloud. Institutions protect their architecture. Admitting that a peer-level capability had slipped through sensors would imply vulnerability, but quietly adapting to that capability preserved operational advantage without public concession. The psychological cost rests in the ambiguity. For the scouts, the experience lingered as a question mark. They knew what they had seen. They knew the precision of the disappearance, yet the official narrative reduced it to terrain. Over time, memory and paperwork diverge. One carries texture, the grit of dust in teeth, the flicker of infrared fading too smoothly. The other carries closure without explanation. The viewer, now holding the full mosaic, can read the discontinuation order for what it was, not abandonment, but containment. The assessment approach to truth the institution found more useful, undocumented. The erased trail in the wadi mirrored the erased trail in the file, and in that symmetry lies the central reversal. The scout team did not fail. They brushed against a capability that existed at the edge of acknowledgement, one that the institution chose to absorb silently rather than define publicly. Silence, again, was not absent. It was a decision. The first sign they had been there was the absence of signs, a ridgeline swept by wind, shale shifting under boots, frost breaking in delicate fractures at dawn. The scout team moved slowly, eyes low, trained to read disturbance the way a forensic analyst reads a crime scene. A displaced pebble, a snapped stem, the faint compression of soil where weight had settled for a fraction of a second too long. There was nothing. No heel strike. No ration wrapper caught in scrub. No radio battery indentation in damp earth. Even the stream crossing showed no turbidity, no recent churn in the silt along the bank. And yet intelligence insisted someone had moved through this corridor within the last 48 hours. The scouts felt it before they understood it. The quiet was too complete, the terrain too undisturbed in a way that felt curated rather than natural. That was the first lesson in the doctrine of not being there. It did not begin as philosophy. It began as survival. In early denied area patrols where small units discovered that their greatest vulnerability was not engagement, but attribution, a boot print led to a border incident, a dropped wrapper became diplomatic leverage, a single casing left behind reframed a reconnaissance mission as an act of aggression. So they adapted. Trail discipline evolved from simple camouflage into ritualized erasure, step in the footprint of the man ahead. Avoid silhouette breaks along skylines, police brass before securing objectives, cross hard surfaces whenever possible, move parallel to water instead of through it to prevent track funnels. In some units, patrol debriefs included a reverse walk of the route, scanning for signatures left behind. It became muscle memory. Over time, the practice hardened into doctrine. Not officially, not in public manuals, but internal SOPs passed between instructors in windowless rooms, annotated in margins, refined after each near compromise. The goal shifted from low visibility to operational non-existence. The distinction mattered. Low visibility suggests difficulty in detection. Non-existence demands the absence of evidence altogether. In modern special reconnaissance environments, that distinction is strategic currency. Satellites orbit at predictable intervals. Thermal imaging scans for heat blooms in unexpected terrain. Signals intelligence triangulates anomalous emissions within seconds. In some contested regions, the density of sensors rivals urban infrastructure. The margin for error has narrowed from meters to centimeters, from minutes to milliseconds, and yet teams still move. They move at night when temperature gradients flatten infrared contrast. They carry power sources shielded against electronic leakage. They avoid local supply chains that could later be traced. They alter gait patterns to mimic indigenous movement signatures. Even their hydration plans account for the disposal of biological waste, buried deep and dispersed to avoid canine detection. The cost is physical. Reduced equipment means fewer redundancies. Silence means limited communication. Isolation means extraction windows that stretch thin. A team operating under true non-attribution protocols may carry 30% less firepower than a conventional element. They accept that trade, because in certain environments, being able to deny presence is worth more than overwhelming force. Consider the arithmetic of escalation. A visible raid invites response. A confirmed incursion triggers mobilization. But an event without evidence becomes a rumor, and rumor rarely mobilizes divisions. The scout team on the ridgeline never found cracks. They reported negative contact. Intelligence quietly adjusted its models. Somewhere a commander exhaled, not in relief but in recognition. The corridor had been used, just not in a way that could be proven. Those scout teams are often the only honest witnesses. They sense the manipulation of terrain, the disciplined absence. They understand that something moved through their sector with intent and competence beyond conventional doctrine. But institutions rarely confirm such encounters. Publicly, nothing happened. Officially, no unit crossed that line. The operators who execute these missions carry a different psychological burden. Their successes are uncelebrated. Their failures are unacknowledged. If compromised, they may not exist on paper. The discipline required is not only tactical, but existential. One former team leader described it in a rare, anonymized interview. The objective wasn't to win, he said. It was to leave the ground arguing with itself. That is the geometry of non-existence. Presence without residue, action without signature, influence without footprint. It requires relentless training and institutional patience, selection processes that filter not only for aggression and endurance, but for restraint, psychological screening that values those comfortable with ambiguity and absence of recognition. A culture that understands that sometimes the most decisive operation is the one that generates no headlines. The lineage of this doctrine stretches from early border reconnaissance units to modern denied area operators inserting into census-saturated theaters. It has adapted to technology, to politics, to the accelerating transparency of the digital age. But its core principle remains constant. In some operational environments, firepower escalates. Intelligence exposes, speed amplifies signature, but invisibility endures. The ridgeline remains empty. Wind moves through grass undisturbed. The scouts pack up and descend, filing their report with a quiet unease they cannot articulate. They know someone was there, they just cannot prove it, and that is precisely the point. Because the most strategically valuable thing a military unit can possess in certain environments is not superior weapons, not superior information, not even superior tempo. It is the disciplined ability to have never been there at all.